"You promised to save us from hunger," the girls told the millionaire, but the truth behind it was something terrible. Comment what you thought of this story with a rating from 0 to 10 and let me know what city you're watching from. I really want to know if you liked my story and get to know you better, so subscribe to my channel to support my work. I'm counting on your help. The March afternoon in Ridgeport was particularly hot when Arthur Blackwood left his office on the main downtown street. At 52, the real estate mogul had built an empire based on discipline and determination, traits that made him respected and feared in equal measure. His always impeccable suits and rigid posture reflected the precision with which he conducted his business. But behind this professional facade, he carried the weight of a loneliness that had consumed him since his divorce 2 years ago. Arthur was adjusting his tie when two small figures approached him on the sidewalk. They were two girls, visibly dirty and thin, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. The smaller one, who looked to be about 4, held tightly to the hand of the other, older one, about 8 years old. Both wore faded, oversized clothes that had seen better days. The older girl shouted for Uncle Arthur, running toward him with her eyes shining with hope and tears, exclaiming that he had finally come back. Arthur stopped abruptly, frowning as he observed the two children. He didn't recognize either of them, but something in the younger one's gaze, a peculiar intensity mixed with familiarity, left him disconcerted. The older girl planted herself in front of him, breathing heavily, as if she had run a long distance. She said that he had promised to save them from hunger, but had never returned, her voice laden with emotion and despair. She added that they had waited for him every day at the square, just as he had told them to. Arthur looked around, hoping someone would come for the girls, or that it was just a misunderstanding. But the street was relatively empty, and the two children stared at him with a familiarity that deeply disturbed him. He told the girls he thought they had him confused with someone else, trying to maintain a gentle tone. He said he had never seen them before and asked where their parents were. The younger girl, who had been silent until then, took a step forward. She introduced herself as Iris in a surprisingly clear voice for her age and said the other was her sister, Violet. She told him that he had promised to take care of them when their mother, Magnolia, went away. The name Magnolia echoed in Arthur's mind, but he couldn't connect it to anyone specific. Violet pulled a small, crumpled notebook from her pocket and opened it with reverent care. She said it was all written down in there, showing him pages covered in a childish but surprisingly neat handwriting. She explained that he had said he would be back in a week with food and that he would help them find their mum. It had been 3 months since they started waiting. Arthur took the notebook, feeling the weight of the situation settle in his chest. The notes were too detailed to be a child's invention. There were specific descriptions of promises, meeting times, and even details about conversations he had supposedly had with them. He asked where they lived, handing back the notebook and crouching down to their level. Iris replied that they lived in the little blue house by the river, pointing in a vague direction. She added that he had gone there and talked to them in the kitchen, saying he liked the smell of cinnamon that was always there. The specific detail about the cinnamon smell intrigued him. It was too particular to be made up. Arthur stood up, looking at the two girls again. Iris had dark brown hair and large eyes that seemed to hold secrets beyond her years. Violet was taller, with lighter hair and a protective stance over her younger sister. He asked with genuine concern if they were living alone. Violet confirmed that they had been, since their mom left. But she insisted that he had said he would take care of them, that he knew their mom from work and she had asked him to look after them. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine. Something was clearly wrong, but the girls seemed genuinely convinced he had made these promises. The determination in Violet's eyes and Iris's innocent trust touched him in a way he hadn't expected. He asked if they could take him to the house, making an impulsive decision that was completely out of character for his usual routine. Violet's face lit up as she asked if he was going to keep his promises now. Arthur replied that he was going to find out what was happening, taking out his car keys. He told them to get in the car, that they were going to resolve this situation. As he drove through the familiar streets of Ridgeport toward the outskirts of town, Arthur couldn't stop thinking about the strange familiarity he felt looking at Iris in the rearview mirror. The girl watched the scenery with a seriousness that didn't match her age, while Violet chattered on about how she had kept the house tidy and waited faithfully for his return. There was something deeply unsettling about the situation, and Arthur knew his life had just taken a completely unexpected turn. The blue house was situated on a dirt road on the outskirts of Ridgeport, surrounded by other simple constructions that highlighted the economic reality of that part of the city. Arthur parked the car in front of the low, peeling wooden gate and observed the property carefully. It was a small house, 2 bedrooms at most, with faded paint and windows in desperate need of repair. Violet exclaimed that this was it, jumping out of the car with enthusiasm. She asked if he remembered the porch where they had talked, pointing to a small covered area in front of the house. Iris got out of the car more slowly, her large eyes fixed on Arthur's face as if trying to read his thoughts. She asked in a soft voice that carried a disconcerting maturity if he was coming inside this time. Arthur followed the girls through the front door, which was unlocked. The interior of the house surprised him with its neatness, considering 2 small children lived there alone. The living room was small but clean, with old but well-cared-for furniture. A floral-patterned sofa dominated the room, flanked by 2 armchairs that had seen better days. Violet, noticing Arthur's evaluative gaze, explained that their mother, Magnolia, always used to say that a messy house meant a messy life, so she kept everything tidy, just as she had taught her. What struck Arthur the most was the smell. There really was a faint aroma of cinnamon in the air, just as Iris had mentioned. He went to the kitchen, a small area at the back of the house, and saw small spice jars arranged on a handmade shelf. One of them, clearly used often, contained cinnamon sticks. Iris, appearing silently beside him, said their mom used to make cinnamon tea for them when they were sick. She added that he had said he liked the smell when he came here. Arthur crouched down again, observing the girl's face. There was something in her eyes that bothered him deeply, a familiarity he couldn't explain, as if he had seen that expression somewhere before. He asked Iris, trying to keep his tone calm, if she could tell him exactly what he had said when he was there. The girl concentrated, furrowing her small brow. She said he sat in their mom's chair, pointing to a wooden chair near the table. She recounted that he had said he knew their mom from her cleaning job, and that she had asked him to take care of them if anything happened. He also said he would bring food and help them find her. Violet joined the conversation, opening her notebook again. She stated that it was all in there, and that he had also said he had a big company and her mom worked at one of his construction sites. Arthur felt a shiver run up his spine. His companies did indeed employ several cleaning crews through subcontractors, but he rarely had direct contact with the employees. The name Magnolia still echoed vaguely in his memory, but he couldn't place it. He asked where exactly her mother worked. Violet replied that she worked in several places, but lately she had been cleaning some new buildings downtown. She always came home very tired and complaining about a man who kept looking at her in a weird way. When asked what kind of weird way, Iris, climbing onto one of the kitchen chairs, said that she didn't explain it well, but she always got nervous when she talked about him, saying he asked too many personal questions. Arthur walked through the small house, observing every detail. In the girls' room, he found 2 single beds made with military precision. Clean clothes were folded in 2 small piles, and a few simple toys were arranged in a corner. On the wall, colorful children's drawings showed a happy family, 2 girls, a woman, and curiously a tall man in a suit. He asked who the man in the drawings was, pointing to the male figure. Iris replied naturally that it was him. She explained that after he came to the house, she drew their new family. Arthur's blood ran cold. The figure in the drawing really did look like him. The graying hair at the temples, the erect posture, even the cut of the suit was similar to what he usually wore. He asked the girls if they were absolutely sure he had been there before. Violet responded with a confused "of course," and added that he even knew the nickname their mom gave her, saying their mom had told him she called her Little Violet. Arthur sat down heavily in the chair Iris had pointed out as the one he had supposedly sat in. Something was profoundly wrong. Either the girls were inventing an elaborate story, which seemed unlikely given the consistency of the details, or someone had impersonated him. He asked them to describe exactly how he was dressed when he came. Violet closed her eyes, concentrating. She described a navy blue suit, white shirt, red tie with small diamonds, and very shiny black shoes, adding that he had a gold watch on his left wrist. The description was precisely the combination Arthur wore on Tuesdays. It was his standard attire for important meetings, a habit he had maintained for years. Few people knew about this peculiarity. He then asked what day of the week he had come. Iris answered immediately that it was a Tuesday morning, right after Violet got back from school. Arthur took his phone out of his pocket and checked his calendar for the past few months. On Tuesday mornings for the last 3 months, he had always been in his office or in documented meetings. There was no gap in his schedule that could explain a visit to this house. He told the girls, choosing his words carefully, that he needed them to understand something. He didn't remember ever coming here before and suggested it was possible they were confusing him with someone else. Violet shook her head energetically, insisting it was him. She even knew the name of the neighbor, Mrs. Gable's dog, Rusty. She said he had mentioned that the dog barked a lot when he arrived. As if on cue, a loud bark echoed from the next yard. Through the kitchen window, Arthur saw a small, scruffy brown dog barking insistently toward their house. Iris, smiling for the first time since they arrived, said that was Rusty, and that he always barks when strangers are around. But the first time he came, the dog stopped barking after a while, as if it had recognized him. Arthur looked at the dog, which continued to bark, and a disturbing idea began to form in his mind. If someone had really impersonated him, this person knew very specific details about his routine, his clothes, and even his work. The question that tormented him now was, who would do this, and why? The next morning, Arthur cancelled all his meetings and drove to the neighborhood where Violet and Iris lived. The night had been a torture of insomnia, filled with unanswered questions hammering in his mind. He decided he needed to investigate the situation more deeply, starting with the neighbors. Mrs. Gable, the owner of the dog Rusty, was a woman of about 70 who had lived next door for over 2 decades. When Arthur knocked on her door, she greeted him with a warm smile and a glint of recognition in her eyes. She exclaimed that it was good he was back, drying her hands on her apron. She had been worried about the girls and said that since his last visit, they had been more cheerful, always talking about when he would return. Arthur felt his stomach churn. He asked Mrs. Gable if she could describe how he looked when he was there. The question seemed to confuse her. She asked why, wondering if he didn't remember. She said he looked very elegant in a navy blue suit, and they had chatted at the gate for a few minutes. He had told her he knew the girl's mother and was going to help them. When asked if he had said anything else, she recalled that he had mentioned working in construction and that Magnolia cleaned one of his buildings. He also said he was worried because she had suddenly disappeared, leaving the girls alone. She paused, frowning, and asked if he was all right, as he seemed a bit confused. Arthur forced a smile, saying he was fine and just wanted to confirm some details. He asked if she remembered anything else about that day. She remembered that he arrived in a very nice black car, similar to the one he had now, pointing to Arthur's vehicle, and that he had asked about the girls' routine, if they were eating well, things like that. After saying goodbye to Mrs. Gable, Arthur visited 3 more neighbors. They all confirmed the same story. A well-dressed, middle-aged man had visited the girls' house about 3 months ago, introducing himself as someone who knew Magnolia from work and was concerned for her daughter's well-being. The physical description varied slightly between accounts, but they all mentioned the navy blue suit and the professional demeanor. The most disturbing part was that they all seemed convinced that man was indeed Arthur. On his way back to the city center, Arthur stopped at a small neighborhood market where, according to Violet, her mother used to shop. The owner, Mr. Henderson, a short, chubby man of about 50, recognized him immediately. He greeted Mr. Arthur, saying it was good to see him again, and asked how the girls were. Arthur could barely hide his shock. He replied that they were fine and started to ask about his last visit. Mr. Henderson chimed in, recalling that he was worried about their situation and that it was good someone cared. He described Magnolia as a good woman who always paid on time but had vanished into thin air, leaving the girls helpless. When asked if he knew Magnolia well, he said he did. She had been coming to his store for about 2 years. She worked hard, sometimes arriving at the end of the day completely exhausted, her hands red from cleaning products. Mr. Henderson lowered his voice, adding that in the time before she disappeared, she was acting strangely, nervous, and always looking over her shoulder as if she was afraid of something. Arthur asked if she had mentioned anything about work. Mr. Henderson said she had mentioned a guy at her job who was bothering her, asking where she lived, if she was single, things like that. The poor woman got scared and went to talk to the boss of the cleaning company. Arthur felt a surge of interest and asked which cleaning company it was. Mr. Henderson thought it was Clean Corp, and that she had worked for them for a while, cleaning several commercial buildings in the city. The name Clean Corp sounded familiar. Arthur remembered that his company had hired their services to clean 2 of his recent developments. The connection was becoming clearer, but also more disturbing. He asked Mr. Henderson if he had bought anything during his last visit. Mr. Henderson confirmed that he had, a bag full of things for the girls: milk, bread, fruit, some treats. He had spent about $100 and said he would start helping them regularly. Arthur left the market with his mind reeling. Someone had not only impersonated him, but had also spent a considerable amount of money to keep the charade convincing. This suggested planning and resources, not just an improvised lie. Back in his office, Arthur asked his secretary, Helen, an efficient 45-year-old woman who had worked with him for over 10 years, to locate all contracts with Clean Corp. Helen returned to his office with a folder, reporting that she had found 2 contracts, one for the cleaning of the St. John commercial building and another for the Spring Garden residential complex. Both had been negotiated by Mr. Bryce Richards. Bryce Richards, his partner and longtime friend. Arthur felt a chill run down his spine at the possibility, but he needed to investigate all leads. He asked Helen to get him a list of all Clean Corp employees who had worked on their projects. She asked if she should look for anyone specific. He told her yes, a woman named Magnolia Santos. 2 hours later, Helen returned with the information. She had found her, Magnolia Santos, 34 years old. She had worked cleaning the St. John building for 8 months, until March of that year, when she was dismissed without prior notice. When Arthur asked why she was dismissed, Helen explained that according to Clean Corp's report, she had missed 3 consecutive days without justification and had not responded to attempts to contact her. Arthur took the file and studied Magnolia's ID photo. She was a young woman with delicate features and tired eyes that reflected the weight of responsibilities beyond her years. There was a subtle resemblance to Iris, especially in the shape of her eyes and her serious expression. At that moment, Bryce Richards walked into his office without knocking, as he always did. At 45, Bryce was a tall, handsome man with always perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable clothes. They had founded the company together 15 years ago, and Arthur had always trusted him completely. Bryce said they needed to talk about the North Side project, but stopped when he saw the documents on the desk and asked what they were. Arthur replied that he was reviewing some old contracts, carefully observing his partner's reaction. He asked if Bryce remembered a Clean Corp employee named Magnolia Santos. For a fraction of a second, something flickered in Bryce's eyes. It was almost imperceptible, but Arthur had learned to read people over years of negotiations. It was a mix of recognition and discomfort. Bryce asked who Magnolia was, claiming not to remember her specifically and asking why. Arthur explained that she had disappeared 3 months ago, leaving 2 young daughters alone, and he was trying to understand what happened. Bryce sat in the chair across the desk, nervously adjusting his tie. He asked if this had anything to do with their company. Arthur replied that maybe it did, as she was working in their building when she disappeared. Bryce told Arthur he couldn't take responsibility for every subcontracted employee, and that if she had personal problems, it wasn't their fault. There was something in Bryce's tone that bothered Arthur, a defensiveness that didn't make sense for a simple question about a former employee. Arthur agreed, saying he was right, and decided not to reveal any more information for the time being, claiming he was just curious. After Bryce left, Arthur was left alone in his office, looking out the window at the busy Ridgeport street. A terrible suspicion was growing in his mind, but he needed more evidence before making any decisions. The question that tormented him now was much more specific. Was it possible that his own partner was involved in Magnolia's disappearance? Arthur decided he needed to find Magnolia personally to understand the whole situation. After a discreet investigation with the help of a private detective he occasionally used to check the backgrounds of business partners, he discovered she was working as a housekeeper in Clearwater Creek, a neighboring town about 20 miles from Ridgeport. On a Thursday morning, he drove to the address provided by the investigator. It was an upper-middle-class house in a quiet residential neighborhood. Arthur parked across the street and waited. Around 2 in the afternoon, he saw a woman leave through the back door. It was undoubtedly Magnolia, although she looked different from the photo in the company file. She had gained some weight, her hair was shorter and well-kept, and she wore clean, proper clothes. She didn't look like a woman on the run or in financial trouble. In fact, she seemed to be doing well, which completely contradicted the narrative of abandonment he had built in his mind. Arthur got out of the car and approached her as she walked toward a bus stop. He called her name, Magnolia Santos. She turned, and when her eyes met his, her expression changed drastically. Her face paled, and she took an instinctive step back, murmuring his name and asking what he wanted with her now, her voice trembling. Her reaction completely confused him. He addressed her as Mrs. Magnolia, introducing himself as Arthur Blackwood and saying he needed to talk to her about her daughters. She exploded with a surprising intensity of anger, telling him not to play dumb with her. She asked how he had the nerve to show his face after everything he had done. Arthur raised his hands in a pacifying gesture, assuring her there must be a misunderstanding and that he had never seen her before in his life. Magnolia studied him with suspicious eyes, as if trying to detect a lie in his face. She asked how he could say he'd never seen her, insisting he came to her house, made those disgusting proposals, and threatened her when she said no. He asked what proposals and what threats, swearing he didn't know what she was talking about. Something in the sincerity of his voice must have reached her, because Magnolia's defensive posture slightly eased. She asked if he really didn't remember. He stated firmly that he had never been to her house and had never spoken to her before. He explained that her daughters had mistaken him for someone else, and he was trying to find out what had happened. Magnolia watched him in silence for a long moment, her features gradually relaxing. She conceded that he was identical to him, the voice, the posture, even the way he dressed. He asked, "Identical to whom?" She replied that it was the man who showed up at her house 3 months ago. He had said he was Arthur Blackwood, the owner of the company that hired Clean Corp. He had claimed to have seen her work and wanted to offer her a special opportunity. Arthur felt his blood run cold and asked what kind of opportunity. Magnolia lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable. She explained that the man had said she could earn much more money if she agreed to do some special favors for him. When she understood what he was suggesting, she told him to leave. When asked what happened then, she said he came back 2 weeks later, calling her ungrateful and saying he could either help her a lot or hurt her a lot. When she refused again, he threatened her. He said he knew where her daughters went to school, where she lived, everything about her life. Arthur felt a rage building in his chest and asked if that was why she ran away. She defensively said it wasn't running away, it was survival. She was afraid of what he might do to her or the girls. She got the job in Clearwater Creek and left the girls in Ridgeport because she thought it would be temporary, just until things calmed down. Arthur questioned the word temporary, pointing out that her daughters had been living alone for 3 months, starving and feeding on the charity of neighbors. Magnolia's face contorted in pain. She claimed she sent money for them, leaving it with Mrs. Gable, and that they knew they could go to her if they needed anything. When Arthur asked what money, noting Mrs. Gable had never mentioned it, Magnolia said she sent it every month, $50 for food and basic needs. Arthur realized that $50 a month was practically nothing for 2 children. Magnolia was clearly deluding herself about the adequacy of the support she was providing. He told her that her daughters had sought him out because they were desperate. They believed he had promised to take care of them because someone had impersonated him. When she asked who would do such a thing and why, he said that was the question he was trying to answer. But first, he needed her to understand that her daughters needed their mother, that they were alone and scared. She said she couldn't go back, shaking her head. She explained that the man had said he was watching her, and if she returned, he might. Arthur interrupted, asking who he was and demanding a precise description. She closed her eyes, concentrating. She described a tall man in his late 40s, with dark hair graying at the sides, very well dressed, always in an expensive suit, with light eyes and a handsome smile, but with something sinister behind it. The description could apply to several people, but there was something familiar about it that bothered Arthur. He asked what kind of car the man drove. She described a very new black sedan with a light leather interior. Arthur felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. The car's description was an exact match for the vehicle Bryce had bought 6 months ago, a black BMW sedan with a beige interior. He asked Magnolia if the man had mentioned any names or called anyone a partner or associate. She said not that she remembered, but he knew many details about the Blackwood and Richards company. He knew about the projects, the contracts with Clean Corp, even about specific meetings. The surname Richards confirmed Arthur's worst suspicions. Bryce had impersonated him, tormented Magnolia, and had even visited her daughters, pretending to be someone who cared about them. But why? Arthur told Magnolia he needed her to come back with him to Ridgeport. He said her daughters needed her, and he could guarantee her safety. She asked how he could guarantee it when he didn't even know who the man was. He replied that actually he had a very strong suspicion, and if he was right, he would make sure the man never bothered her again. Magnolia studied him again, this time looking for signs of sincerity. She asked why he was doing this, why he cared about a stranger and her daughters. Arthur thought about the question for a moment. He said it was because someone had used his name to cause suffering to innocent people, and because those girls didn't deserve to pay for the mistakes of adults. She asked what would happen if she went back and the man found her. He promised he wouldn't, because when he was finished dealing with him, He wouldn't be in a position to bother anyone ever again. There was a cold determination in Arthur's voice that made Magnolia realize he was serious. For the first time in 3 months, she began to believe she might actually be able to go home. She finally agreed, but asked him to promise her one thing. When he asked what, she said she wanted her daughters never to know the truth about why she left, that they didn't need to know what kind of men exist in the world. Arthur nodded, but internally he knew there were still many secrets to be revealed before this story reached its end. The journey back to Ridgeport was marked by a tense silence. Magnolia looked nervously out the window, clearly tormented by thoughts of reuniting with her daughters after a 3-month absence. Arthur, for his part, was mentally planning how he would confront Bryce about his suspicions. When they arrived at the Blue House, it was almost late afternoon. Violet was in the small yard, trying to hang some washed clothes on a makeshift clothesline strung between 2 trees. Seeing Arthur's car, she ran toward the gate but stopped abruptly when she saw who was getting out of the passenger seat. She murmured, "Mom," as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Magnolia knelt on the ground, opening her arms. She called out to her little Violet, her daughter. The girl hesitated for a few seconds, then ran into her mother's arms, starting to cry convulsively. She cried that her mom was back, that she thought she had gone away forever. Iris appeared at the door of the house, observing the scene with her large, serious eyes. Unlike her sister, she did not run immediately to Magnolia. Instead, she stood still, studying the woman as if trying to decide if she was real. Magnolia called for her little Iris to come here, extending an arm toward her younger daughter. The girl approached slowly, her expression cautious. She asked her mother why she had left without them. The simple, direct question left Magnolia visibly shaken. She stammered that she had needed to work far away for a while, but now she was here. Iris continued, her small but firm voice stating that her mother had promised never to leave them alone, that she had said they were a family and that families stay together. Arthur watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a heavy heart. It was obvious that Iris had been deeply affected by the abandonment. The girl maintained an emotional distance that contrasted sharply with Violet's explosive relief. Arthur suggested they go inside, saying they had a lot to talk about. Inside the house, Magnolia was shocked to see how her daughters had survived. The impeccable organization that Violet maintained was impressive, but it also revealed the weight of responsibilities that an 8-year-old child should not have to bear. Magnolia asked Violet how they had managed on their own all this time. Examining the almost empty refrigerator and the meticulously organized cupboards, Violet replied with a sad pride that she had taken care of everything. She had taken Iris to school every day, shopped at Mr. Henderson's market, and kept the house clean, using the money her mother sent only for very necessary things. Arthur asked what money, already suspecting the answer. Violet explained it was the $50 her mom sent every month through Mrs. Gable. Magnolia looked confused, saying she sent more than that, $100 a month. An uncomfortable silence filled the room. Arthur realized that Mrs. Gable had probably kept half the money, perhaps justifying to herself that she was helping in some way. He quickly said it didn't matter now, not wanting to create more conflict, and that the important thing was that they were together again. It was then that Iris made a statement that chilled everyone in the room. She said casually, while playing with a rag doll, that the fake Uncle Arthur also sent them money. Magnolia, alarmed, asked what she meant. Iris explained that the man who called himself Uncle Arthur would come by sometimes and leave money under the flower pot on the porch. Violet would always find it and use it to buy food. Violet nodded, confirming her sister's story. She said he told them not to tell anyone, that it was a secret between them. She thought it was strange, but they were hungry, so they used it. Arthur felt as if the floor was collapsing beneath his feet. Bryce hadn't just impersonated him once. He had established a pattern of behavior, visiting the girls regularly and creating a relationship of dependency. He asked, trying to keep his voice calm, if they knew when he had last come by. Iris replied that it was last week. He seemed different, more nervous, and had asked if anyone had come to talk to them, if they had told anyone about him. When asked if they had told anyone, Violet said no, explaining that he always said it was important to keep it a secret, that bad people might try to separate them if they knew. Arthur understood that Bryce had created a situation of emotional blackmail with the children. They depended on him financially, but were also manipulated into keeping his existence a secret. He crouched down to their level, telling the girls they needed to understand that the man was not him, that he was lying to them. Violet protested that he knew so many things about him, his company, his routine, and even... She stopped abruptly, as if remembering something important. Arthur pressed her, asking what else he knew. The girl exchanged a nervous glance with Iris before answering. She said he knew about his wife. When Arthur asked if she meant his ex-wife, Iris, her voice even lower, said no. The man had told them he had a wife who had gone to heaven, and that's why he understood their pain of not having their mum around. Arthur froze. His wife, Mariana, had passed away 2 years ago in a car accident, but it wasn't a topic he discussed openly. Very few people knew the personal details of his life, and Bryce was one of them. He asked, his voice almost a whisper, if the man had said anything else about his wife. Violet replied that he said she was very beautiful and that they didn't have children because she got sick. And because of that, he felt lonely and wanted to help children like them. Magnolia watched the conversation with growing horror, wondering what kind of person does that to children, using someone's pain to manipulate innocence. Arthur stood up, walking to the window. The anger he felt was turning into something more dangerous, a cold determination to confront Bryce and find out how far this charade went. He told Magnolia he needed her and the girls to stay there that night, and that tomorrow they would resolve the situation for good. When she asked what he was going to do, he said he was going to have a very serious conversation with his partner. Magnolia warned him that the man could be dangerous, considering everything he had done. Arthur replied, with a new hardness in his voice, that he knew how to deal with men like Bryce Richards. He had made the mistake of using his name and messing with innocent people, and it would not go unpunished. That night, while Magnolia tried to reconnect with her daughters, Arthur carefully planned how he would confront the man he had considered a friend and partner for over 15 years. But one question tormented him. If Bryce was capable of manipulating 2 orphaned children this way, what other things had he done behind Arthur's back? The answer to that question would come very soon, and it would be more shocking than he had ever imagined. The next morning, Arthur arrived at the office earlier than usual, determined to confront Bryce, before the normal work day prevented them from having a serious conversation. He asked Helen to cancel all his morning meetings and to have Bryce meet him in the conference room. Bryce arrived promptly at 8 o'clock, as he always did. Arthur watched him through the blinds of his office. His partner greeted Helen with his usual charm, checked the mail, and headed to his own office with the confidence of someone with nothing to hide. Arthur waited another 15 minutes before knocking on Bryce's door. Bryce called out cheerfully for him to enter, saying he was just reviewing the numbers for the North Side project and they had good news. Arthur told Bryce they needed to talk in the conference room now. Something in his tone made Bryce look up from his papers and ask if something had happened. Arthur repeated his request and left without waiting for an answer. In the meeting room, Arthur closed the door and activated the anti-eavesdropping device, a precaution they always took when discussing important contracts. This time, the precaution had a very different reason. Bryce said Arthur was making him nervous and asked what was wrong. Arthur simply said the name Magnolia Santos. The change in Bryce's expression was subtle, but Arthur was watching carefully. It was as if a veil had fallen over his eyes, replacing the casualness with something more calculated. Bryce asked who that was. Arthur told him not to waste his time with lies, that he knew Magnolia Santos, the former Clean Corp employee and mother of two girls, Violet and Iris. Bryce leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming nervously on the table. He said, "Oh yes, the woman who cleaned the St. John building, and hadn't she disappeared a few months ago?" Arthur stated flatly that she disappeared because Bryce had threatened her. The ensuing silence was heavy with tension. Bryce studied Arthur's face, clearly calculating his options. He started to say he didn't know what kind of story someone had told him, but Arthur cut him off, saying she had told him personally yesterday. She told him about his indecent proposals, his threats, and how he had impersonated him to try to intimidate her. Bryce sighed deeply, as if making a difficult decision. He admitted that maybe he had been a bit too direct with her, but claimed it was nothing like what Arthur was insinuating. When Arthur questioned what too direct meant, Bryce explained that she was an attractive, hard-working woman who seemed to need financial help, so he offered her an opportunity to earn extra money doing some personal services. The coldness with which Bryce said this made Arthur feel nauseous. He asked what personal services meant. Bryce replied it was just cleaning his house, organizing some social events, nothing major. Arthur called him a liar. He stood up, walking to the window, and said she had told him exactly what kind of opportunity he had offered and how he had reacted when she refused. Bryce asked if Arthur was believing the word of a desperate woman over his partner of 15 years. Arthur replied that he was believing the evidence, like the fact that Bryce had impersonated him when he went to threaten her. Bryce was silent for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of innocence. He said Arthur had always been too straight-laced, too moral. He knew Arthur wouldn't approve of his methods of persuasion, so yes, he had used his name because it was more efficient. Arthur questioned his use of the term methods of persuasion. Bryce claimed Magnolia was being stubborn, refusing a very good financial opportunity because of silly prejudices. He thought that if she believed the proposal came from Arthur, someone she respected as a boss, she would be more receptive. Arthur turned to face Bryce, struggling to control his anger. He asked what happened when she still refused. Bryce explained that he made it clear it wasn't smart to refuse help from important people, and that those who don't cooperate can end up losing the job they already have. Arthur accused him of threatening her using his name. Bryce countered that he used negotiation strategies, just as they did with difficult clients every day. The comparison between sexual harassment and legitimate business left Arthur even more outraged. He then asked about her daughters, how Bryce could justify visiting two small children, impersonating him, and creating an elaborate charade. For the first time, Bryce seemed genuinely uncomfortable. He started to deny it, but Arthur cut him off, telling him not to lie. He explained that Violet and Iris had sought him out because they believed he was Bryce. They had detailed notes of his visits and promises. He hadn't just impersonated him, he had manipulated two orphaned children. Bryce stood up abruptly, pacing back and forth. He finally admitted that maybe he had visited them a few times, but claimed it was out of compassion. When Magnolia fled, she left the girls alone, and he felt responsible. Arthur shot back that he was responsible for the abandonment he had caused. Bryce insisted he was trying to help, that he brought money and food and made sure they were okay, asking what was wrong with that. Arthur retorted that what was wrong was that he did it while impersonating him, using his identity and reputation to cover his own guilt. Bryce stopped pacing and faced Arthur directly. He asked if he wanted to know the truth. Yes, he had used his name. Because he knew if he told the girls it was him, they might tell someone about his connection to their mother's disappearance. It was simpler to let them believe Arthur was helping out of kindness. Arthur asked who it was simpler for. Bryce replied that it was simpler for all of them. including Arthur. He questioned whether it would be good for their company if people knew one of the partners was involved with a subcontracted employee who had mysteriously disappeared. Arthur realized that Bryce was showing no remorse, only frustration at being caught. He asked how many others there were. When Bryce feigned confusion, Arthur clarified, asking how many other women he had approached using his name, how many other families he had destroyed. Bryce laughed bitterly, calling Arthur naive. He asked if he really thought they built this empire on honesty and hard work alone, stating that sometimes more persuasive methods were necessary. Arthur demanded he answer the question. Bryce admitted there weren't many, maybe 3 or 4 over the years, women who worked for their suppliers, who were in difficult financial situations. He offered them opportunities to earn extra money. When asked what happened when they refused, he said most didn't. When you're desperate to feed your children, you tend to be more flexible. Bryce's casual admission of exploiting vulnerable women made Arthur want to vomit. He called him a monster. Bryce replied that he was a businessman who understood how the world really worked. In that moment, Arthur understood that the man sitting across from him was no longer the friend and partner he thought he knew. Maybe he never had been. He told Bryce their partnership was over and that he wanted him out of the company. Bryce countered that Arthur couldn't force him out, as he was a partner with 40% of the shares. Arthur said he could and he would, that he had enough evidence of misconduct to take him to court, unless he preferred to leave voluntarily. Bryce sat down again, his expression growing more serious. He told Arthur he didn't want to do that there were things about their company Arthur didn't know, things that could harm him too if they came to light. When asked what kind of things, Bryce mentioned contracts obtained through unconventional methods and permits approved faster than they should have been. He asked if Arthur really thought they had grown so fast on merit alone. Arthur felt the ground collapse beneath him and asked if Bryce had involved him in corruption without his knowledge. Bryce replied that Arthur had never asked how he managed to solve certain bureaucratic problems so quickly, nor questioned why they always won the most competitive bids. He had simply enjoyed the results. The revelation that his company, his reputation, and possibly his freedom were compromised by actions he was unaware of left Arthur in a state of shock. Bryce stood up, adjusting his suit with the confidence of someone who had just turned the tables. He asked his partner how they should move forward from here. Arthur spent the rest of that morning locked in his office, trying to process the magnitude of what Bryce had revealed. 15 years of partnership, 15 years building what he believed to be a respectable company, only to discover it was all founded on corruption and blackmail. He asked Helen not to transfer any calls and to cancel all his appointments for the day. He needed to think to understand the extent of the damage and, most importantly, to find a way to protect not only himself, but also Magnolia and her daughters. Around noon, his cell phone rang. It was Magnolia, her voice filled with panic. She told Arthur he needed to come there right away, that Iris was very sick. He didn't ask for details. He ran out of the office, ignoring the curious looks from Helen and the other employees. During the entire drive to the Blue House, his heart pounded erratically. The girl had already suffered too much in her short life. When he arrived at the house, he found Magnolia pacing nervously in the living room while Violet held Iris's hand. Iris was lying on the sofa, visibly pale and struggling to breathe. He knelt beside the girl and asked what had happened. Magnolia explained, tears streaming down her face, that she had woken up like that in the morning, complaining of a stomachache and dizziness. She had tried to give her fever medicine, but she couldn't even drink water. Arthur touched Iris's forehead and realized she was burning with fever. The girl opened her eyes and tried to smile at him, but it was obvious she was very weak. She murmured, "Uncle Arthur," saying she felt like her mom did when she got sick. When he asked what she meant, she explained that before her mom left, she would sometimes get like this, very weak, with a stomachache, saying it was because she wasn't eating right. Arthur looked at Magnolia, who paled at her daughter's words. She whispered the word malnutrition, realizing they had gone hungry for so long that their bodies couldn't take it anymore. Arthur declared they were going to the hospital now. Magnolia worried they didn't have money for a private hospital and the public one. Arthur interrupted, telling her not to worry about money and that he would take care of everything, scooping Iris into his arms. At the hospital, while Iris was being treated in the emergency room, Arthur, Magnolia, and Violet waited in the hallway. The doctor who examined her, Dr. Norton, a young and competent woman, confirmed their suspicions. Severe malnutrition had compromised Iris's immune system, leaving her vulnerable to infections. The doctor explained that she would need to be admitted for a few days for hydration and observation, but the good news was that they had arrived in time. A few more days, and it could have been much more serious. While Iris slept sedated in the hospital bed, Arthur sat next to Violet in the hallway. The girl had been completely silent since they arrived, observing everything with a seriousness that shouldn't exist in an 8-year-old. He gently told Violet that Iris was going to be fine. She replied that she knew, but her voice was laden with guilt. She said it was her fault, that she should have taken better care of her. He told her it wasn't her fault, that they were children and shouldn't have been left alone. She insisted that as the older sister, it was her responsibility. Arthur sat on the floor next to her chair, getting to her level. He told her to listen carefully, that none of this was her fault, that adults had failed them and that he had failed them. The girl looked at him with her large, serious eyes and said he hadn't failed, he had found them. He replied that it should have been sooner. At that moment, Magnolia joined them, bringing coffee from the hallway machine. She had been crying, but now seemed more composed. Arthur asked her how she had managed to support 2 daughters with so little money for 3 months. She answered defensively that she sent what she could, that $100 a month was almost a third of what she earned. Arthur pointed out that only $50 had reached the girls. Magnolia frowned, confused. He explained that Mrs. Gable kept half, that the girls had told him they received $50 a month through her. The revelation left Magnolia visibly shaken. She couldn't believe it, saying she had trusted that woman and thought she was helping. Arthur commented that people take advantage of vulnerable situations, automatically thinking of Bryce, but he added that it still didn't explain how 2 children survived for 3 months on $50 a month. Violet reminded them that the man impersonating him also gave them money, sometimes leaving $20 or $30 under the pot on the porch. When asked how often, she said about once a week, especially when they were out of food. Arthur realized that Bryce had created a perverse system. He kept the girls on the edge of survival, dependent on his generosity, but never comfortable enough to stop needing him. It was a refined and cruel form of psychological control. Magnolia said there was something she didn't understand, why he would do that, why he would go to the trouble of caring for the girls. Arthur had wondered the same thing. He explained it was about control. As long as they depended on him, they wouldn't dare speak about what had happened. And if something went wrong, he could always claim he was helping out of kindness. At that moment, his phone rang. It was Helen. She apologized for bothering him, but there was an urgent situation. Mr. Bryce had called an emergency meeting with all employees for that afternoon, claiming Arthur was going through personal problems and that he would be temporarily taking over the management of the company. Arthur felt his blood boil. Bryce was taking advantage of his absence to seize control. He told Helen to cancel the meeting and that he would be there in an hour. She replied that Bryce claimed to have legal authorization and had brought some documents. The call ended before Helen could finish the sentence. Arthur looked at his phone, realizing Bryce had cut his line. Magnolia, noticing his expression, asked what was wrong. He told her Bryce was trying to take over the company while he was at the hospital. When she asked if he could do that, he said he shouldn't be able to, but apparently he had documents saying otherwise. Arthur stood up, running a hand through his hair. He said he needed to go back to the office and told them to stay there with Iris, promising to return as soon as he resolved the situation. But when Arthur arrived at his office building, he found two security guards at the door who wouldn't let him in. One of them, clearly uncomfortable, apologized and explained that Mr. Bryce had instructed them that he was temporarily suspended from the company for health reasons. When Arthur questioned the health reasons, declaring he was the majority partner, the guard said he was just following orders and that Mr. Bryce had a court order authorizing the temporary suspension. Arthur took the documents and examined them quickly. It was a suspension order based on emotional instability and erratic behavior that endangers the continuity of the business. The petition was signed by a lawyer he had never seen before, who apparently represented Bryce's interests. He asked when it was signed and was told it was that morning. Arthur realized Bryce had planned everything. He probably had the documents prepared even before their conversation that morning, just waiting for the right moment to use them. As he stood on the sidewalk, looking at the building he had helped build and from which he was now banned, Arthur understood the extent of the trap he had fallen into. Bryce had not only used his name to commit crimes, he had systematically prepared a way to destroy him completely. In that moment, with Iris in the hospital, Magnolia and Violet depending on his help, and his own company stolen from his hands, Arthur had never felt so lost in his entire life. But one thing he knew for sure: he wasn't going to give up without a fight. Arthur spent the night at the hospital, dividing his time between watching Iris sleep and making calls to lawyers who could help him contest the company suspension order. With each attempt, he faced the same reality. Bryce had meticulously prepared his move, using documents that seemed legitimate and a history of behavior he had fabricated over the years. Mr. Robert Sampson, one of Ridgeport's top corporate lawyers and an old acquaintance of Arthur's, agreed to meet him in the hospital cafeteria at 6 in the morning. When he arrived, he wore a grave expression that did not bode well. He told Arthur the situation was more complex than he had imagined. Opening his briefcase, Bryce had not only filed for temporary suspension, but was moving forward with a full action to remove him from the company. When asked on what grounds, Robert explained it was allegations of erratic behavior, questionable business decisions, and most importantly, involvement with criminal elements. He had witnesses who confirmed Arthur had been visiting a family involved in suspicious situations. Arthur's blood ran cold as he asked who the witnesses were. Robert replied it was neighbors from the girl's neighborhood. Apparently, several people had confirmed seeing him frequently at the house of a woman who had mysteriously disappeared, leaving minor children in a state of abandonment. Arthur started to protest, but Robert acknowledged it was a distortion of the facts, but legally, the appearances were damaging. Bryce had constructed a narrative where Arthur appeared as someone involved with a troubled family, a possible cause of a woman's disappearance, and now financially responsible for children who were not his. When Arthur asked about the crimes Bryce had committed, the harassment, the threats, the use of his identity, Robert sighed. He explained it was his word against Bryce's, and Bryce was prepared for that too. He had documents showing he had made charitable donations to the girls, always using his own name. If Arthur accused him of impersonation, Bryce could claim it was Arthur who tried to cover up his own actions by using his name. The perversity of the situation left Arthur momentarily speechless. Bryce had created a perfect trap where any accusation Arthur made against him could be reversed. He asked Robert how much time he had to gather evidence. Robert told him the preliminary hearing was the next day. If the judge upheld the suspension, he would have 30 days to present a full defense. But then Robert hesitated before continuing. saying there was something else Arthur needed to know. Bryce was not acting alone. He had support from outside investors, people apparently interested in acquiring his share of the company. If he were officially removed, his shares could be bought at a liquidation price. When asked who these investors were, Robert said he was still investigating, but they seemed to be businessmen from New York with strong political connections, the kind of people who don't get involved in small businesses unless they see a substantial profit opportunity. Arthur understood he was facing not just Bryce's betrayal, but an organized operation to steal everything he had built over 15 years. When Robert left, Arthur returned to the room where Iris slept, connected to IVs and monitors. Magnolia was sitting in a chair by the bed, and Violet was asleep in another chair, using Arthur's coat as a blanket. He whispered to ask how she was. Magnolia replied softly that she was better, that the fever had broken during the night, and the doctor said if she continued to improve, she could be discharged the next day. He then asked how she was feeling. Magnolia looked at her daughters before answering that she felt guilty, scared, and confused. She paused, choosing her words carefully, and asked Arthur if he was losing his company because of them. He told her it wasn't their fault, that it was his fault for blindly trusting Bryce for so long. She insisted that if he hadn't helped them. He cut her off, saying that if he hadn't helped them, a 4-year-old child could have died from malnutrition, and he didn't regret a thing. At that moment, Iris stirred in bed, slowly opening her eyes. She murmured, "Uncle Arthur." He replied that he was there and asked how she was feeling. She said she was better but worried. When he asked what she was worried about, she said it was him, that he looked sad, and asked if it was because of the conversation she had overheard. Arthur was surprised by the girl's perception and asked what conversation she had heard. She spoke of the bad man who wanted to steal his company and asked if he was the same one who had pretended to be him. The mental clarity of Iris, even weakened by illness, impressed Arthur. He asked how she knew that. She explained that when the man came to their house, he would sometimes talk on the phone. One time she heard him say that the idiot Arthur would never find out until it was too late. Magnolia and Arthur exchanged glances. This was the first time Iris had mentioned hearing Bryce's phone conversations. He asked Iris if she remembered anything else he had said on the phone. The girl closed her eyes, concentrating. She said he talked about money, about how he was going to get rich when he got rid of his partner. And one time he talked about some men from New York who were going to help him. When asked for more details, she said he mentioned they had experience in getting people out of the way without using violence, that they knew how to make it look like the person had done wrong things. The girl's words confirmed Arthur's suspicions about the organized nature of the operation against him, but it also gave him something he didn't have before, a witness to Bryce's plans. He asked Iris if she would tell these things to a judge if she had to. The girl nodded seriously, saying she would if it was to help him, because he was a good person and the other man was not. Violet had woken up during the conversation and now joined in. She said she had also heard some things. He didn't know she was listening, but one time he talked about how he was going to use the girls, them, as evidence that Arthur was mentally unstable. When Arthur asked what she meant, she explained that the man said a single man who suddenly takes responsibility for children who aren't his without a legal process looked suspicious, and that people would think he had ulterior motives. The calculated evil of Bryce, using his own victims as evidence against Arthur, was even more revolting than he had imagined. At that moment, Dr. Norton entered the room for the morning checkup and asked how their special patient was doing today. Iris, trying to sit up in bed, replied that she was much better. The doctor said that was great, and if she kept it up she could go home that afternoon, but would need special care for a few weeks, a balanced diet, vitamins, and plenty of rest. After the doctor left, Arthur made a decision that surprised even himself. He told Magnolia he wanted her and the girls to come live temporarily at his house. Magnolia started to protest, but he insisted it wasn't charity, it was strategy. If Bryce was using them as evidence against him, then he needed to be close to protect them, and if Bryce found out, they could testify against him. Arthur didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. When she asked if he thought Bryce would be capable of hurting them, Arthur replied that he believed a man capable of blackmail, harassment, and corruption was capable of anything when cornered. That afternoon, when Iris was discharged, Arthur took the family to his home, a large residence in an affluent Ridgeport neighborhood that had felt too big and empty since his divorce. For the first time in years, the house was filled with the voices of children echoing through the halls, but as he arranged accommodations for his new guests, Arthur couldn't help but think that he was entering the most dangerous phase of this whole situation. Bryce now knew he had lost control of the narrative, and desperate men are unpredictable. The war for the future of his company and for the safety of 3 innocent people was just beginning. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 2 in the afternoon, and Arthur spent the entire morning preparing his defense with Robert. On his dining room table, they spread out documents, contracts, and evidence that could prove Arthur's innocence and expose Bryce's crimes. Violet and Iris played quietly in the next room, while Magnolia organized the clothes Arthur had bought for them the day before. The atmosphere in the house was tense, as everyone understood that the outcome of that afternoon would determine not only the future of the company, but also the family's safety. Robert asked if the girls were prepared to testify if necessary. Arthur replied that Iris was, that she was determined to tell the truth, while Violet was more nervous but also wanted to help. The problem, Robert noted, was that Bryce could argue that such young children were easily influenced, especially considering they were now living in his house. At that moment, Arthur's phone rang. It was Helen, his former secretary, whispering as if she was afraid of being heard. She apologized for calling, but said she needed to tell him something. Mr. Bryce had fired half the staff yesterday, claiming the company was undergoing urgent restructuring. When Arthur asked which employees, she specified it was all the long-term ones, especially those who knew both partners well. Only the newest employees and some he had brought in from outside remained. Arthur immediately understood the strategy. Bryce was eliminating potential witnesses who could contradict his version of events. He asked Helen if she still had access to the company's system. She said technically no, but she had forgotten to return her emergency password and asked why. He told her he needed her to access the files from the last 6 months, specifically contracts with Clean Corp and any correspondence between Bryce and external investors. Helen expressed concern that it could get her in trouble. Arthur appealed to their 10-year working relationship, saying she knew what kind of man he was, and if they didn't do something now, Bryce would destroy everything they had built together. After a prolonged silence, Helen agreed. She said she would see what she could do, but needed to be quick. An hour later, Helen called back, her voice filled with urgency. She had found something. Bryce had a secret contract with a group of investors from New York. The deal provided for the purchase of Arthur's stake in the company for only 20% of its market value, provided he could prove administrative incompetence and inappropriate behavior on Arthur's part. Arthur asked her to send him copies of the documents. She said she had already sent them to Mr. Sampson's email, but there was more. She had found correspondence where Bryce discussed neutralizing potential witnesses, with one message specifically mentioning Magnolia Santos and the need to discredit any testimony she might give. Robert, who had been listening on speakerphone, immediately began printing the documents arriving in his email. He told Helen this was enough to completely turn the case around, that she had just given them evidence of commercial conspiracy and witness intimidation. But their joy was cut short when Magnolia ran into the room, visibly terrified. She told Arthur there was a black car parked in front of the house for the last half hour, that the driver hadn't gotten out but was just watching them. Arthur looked out the window and saw a dark sedan with tinted windows parked across the street. It was impossible to see who was inside, but the vehicle's presence was no coincidence. When Robert suggested calling the police, Arthur quickly said no. If they called the police now, Bryce could claim they were being paranoid and use it as evidence of mental instability. He decided they would go to the hearing and use this as further proof of intimidation. An hour before the hearing, the mysterious car finally drove away, but it left a sense of threat in the air. Arthur decided to take Magnolia and the girls to the courthouse in a taxi while he and Robert went in the lawyer's car. At the Ridgeport courthouse, Arthur was shocked by the number of people at the hearing. Besides Bryce and his lawyers, there were local journalists and several people he didn't recognize, but who were clearly there at his ex-partner's request. Bryce was elegantly dressed, as always, and greeted Arthur with a cold, calculated smile, saying he hoped Arthur understood this was just business, nothing personal. Arthur asked if threatening children was also just business to him. Bryce replied that he didn't know what he was talking about, but something in his eyes confirmed he knew exactly about the car that had been watching the house. When the hearing began, Bryce's lawyer presented a devastatingly well-prepared case. Witnesses confirmed Arthur had been seen frequently in Magnolia's neighborhood at suspicious times. Documents showed he had spent significant amounts on a family with whom he had no legal connection, and most importantly, they alleged his behavior had become erratic and obsessive. When it was the defense's turn, Robert presented the documents Helen had discovered. The impact in the room was immediate. The secret contract with the New York investors and the correspondence about witness intimidation completely changed the dynamics of the hearing. But it was when Iris was called to testify that something no one expected happened. The girl, despite being only 4 years old, spoke with stunning clarity about Bryce's visits, the phone conversations she had overheard, and especially about how he had manipulated the situation to harm Arthur. She looked directly at the judge and said the bad man had told her he was going to make everyone believe that Uncle Arthur was a bad person, but that Uncle Arthur had saved her life and the bad man had only used them. When Bryce's lawyer tried to question the credibility of such a young child's testimony, Iris did something that silenced the entire room. She asked if he wanted her to prove she was telling the truth. The judge, clearly intrigued, asked how she would do that. She said she had recorded one of his conversations on her sister's phone. The silence in the room was absolute. Violet ran to where she was sitting and took an old cell phone from her bag. She explained that she had taught Iris how to use the recording function when they were alone, just in case of an emergency where they needed proof. The recording was played in the room, and Bryce's voice could be clearly heard planning Arthur's destruction, discussing how to use the girls as evidence against him, and coordinating with the New York investors to take control of the company. When the recording ended, Bryce was visibly shaken. His lawyer requested a recess, but the damage was already done. The judge not only immediately revoked Arthur's suspension order, but also ordered a criminal investigation into Bryce for corporate fraud, blackmail, and witness intimidation. As they left the courthouse, Arthur hugged the girls with tears in his eyes. He told them they had saved not only his company, but had probably saved other families from going through what they had. But even with the legal victory, Arthur knew there was still a long battle ahead. Bryce would not disappear quietly, and the New York investors would not give up easily on a deal they considered profitable. The war was far from over, but for the first time in weeks, Arthur felt he had a real chance of winning. In the 2 weeks following the hearing, Arthur worked tirelessly to rebuild his company. Bryce had disappeared after the exposure of his crimes. leaving behind an administrative mess that would take months to fully resolve. Many of the fired employees returned, but the trust of clients and suppliers had to be gradually regained. Magnolia and the girls had settled comfortably into Arthur's house, creating a family dynamic he had never experienced before. Iris had fully recovered from her malnutrition and was once again a vibrant and curious child. Violet, for her part, was attending a private school where she could finally act like an 8-year-old, without the weight of adult responsibilities. On a Thursday morning, as Arthur reviewed contracts in his home office, Magnolia brought him coffee and sat in the armchair across from his desk. She told him they needed to talk about the future, her voice carrying a seriousness he had learned to respect. When he asked what kind of future, she specified theirs, this improvised family they had created, the girls and them. Arthur put down his papers and watched her attentively. In recent months, Magnolia had transformed from a scared, fugitive woman into someone strong and determined. The experience of almost losing her daughters had awakened a courage in her she didn't know she possessed. He asked what she was thinking. She replied that she was thinking they couldn't live forever in this temporary situation. The girls were getting used to this house, this life, and to him as a father figure. But what would happen when he decided to move on, when he found someone to marry? What would happen to them? The question caught Arthur off guard. In recent months, he had been so focused on protecting this family that he hadn't thought about the long-term implications. He told Magnolia he had no plans to marry again, that this house was too big for one person, and that they had brought a joy he hadn't felt in years. She countered that it wasn't fair to him, that he deserved to have his own family, his own children. He asked what if he considered that he already did. The ensuing silence was charged with emotion. Magnolia studied him, trying to discern if he was being serious or just kind. She told him he knew she was a simple woman, a housekeeper with 2 daughters and a complicated past, that she didn't belong in his world. He replied that she had saved his life as much as he had saved hers. Before them, he was just existing, not living, working 16 hours a day to escape the emptiness of his house. Now he woke up every day knowing there were people who genuinely cared about him. At that moment, Iris ran into the office, holding a drawing she had made at school. She called out to Uncle Arthur to look at what she had drawn for him. The drawing showed a house with 4 people in front, a tall man, a woman, and 2 girls. Everyone was smiling and had red hearts floating around them. She proudly explained that it was their family, that her teacher had told them to draw their family, and she had drawn them. Arthur looked at Magnolia, seeing tears in her eyes. He asked Iris if she would like them to be a real family. The girl replied with childhood simplicity that they already were, that the paper was just to make it official. Violet appeared at the door just then, returning from school, and asked what they were talking about. Arthur replied that they were talking about the future. He asked Violet if she would like him to officially adopt them, for her mother and him to get married and become a real family. Violet's reaction was unexpected. Instead of joy, she began to cry. Arthur and Magnolia looked at each other, worried. Magnolia asked her daughter what was wrong. The girl tearfully asked if they got married. Would it mean they would stay here forever, that no one would ever try to separate them again? The question revealed the deep insecurity the girl still carried after months of abandonment and uncertainty. Arthur promised her it was forever, kneeling in front of her. He assured her that no one would ever separate them again. That afternoon, while the girls played in the yard, Arthur formally proposed to Magnolia. It wasn't an elaborate or traditionally romantic proposal. It was an honest conversation between 2 people who had been through adversity together and discovered they formed a better family, united than separated. But their happiness was interrupted when Robert called with worrying news. He told Arthur that Bryce hadn't disappeared completely, that he was hiding in New York, but still had contact with the investors. Worse, they were planning a new strategy to attack him. When asked what kind of strategy, Robert explained they had found out about his relationship with Magnolia and the girls and were preparing a smear campaign alleging he had taken advantage of a vulnerable woman and her daughters to improve his image after the scandal. Arthur felt his anger rise, asking if they would ever stop. Robert replied that they wouldn't until they got what they wanted. But there was more. He had information that they had hired a private investigator to dig into Magnolia's past, looking for anything they could use to tarnish their reputation. When Arthur insisted Magnolia had nothing to hide, Robert warned that everyone has something, and these men were experts at twisting innocent truths into damaging scandals. That night, Arthur decided to tell Magnolia about the new threat. She listened in silence, her expression growing increasingly tense. She finally said there was something she had never told him. Arthur felt his stomach clench as he asked what it was. She revealed that Violet's father was not the same as Iris's father. The revelation surprised him, but not as much as he expected. He asked if it mattered. She said not to her. But for people who wanted to harm them, they could use it to claim she was a woman of dubious morals and that he was involved with someone unsuitable. Arthur assured her that he didn't care how many men she had in her past, that what mattered was who she was now. But she said there was more. Iris's father. He never knew she existed. When she found out she was pregnant, he had already moved to another state. She tried to contact him but never could. Arthur began to understand where the conversation was heading and asked if she thought they could find him. She said if they did, and if he wanted to cause trouble, he could claim paternal rights over Iris, alleging he didn't know about his daughter because she had hidden it from him. The possibility of losing Iris, after everything they had been through, was unacceptable to Arthur. The girl had become like a daughter to him, and the idea of someone trying to separate them was terrifying. He asked for the man's name and where he lived when she knew him. She said it was Charles Henry Fields. He was a sales representative for a construction materials company. He came to Ridgeport for work. They met, had a brief relationship, and when he was promoted and transferred to Denver, she thought it was better not to complicate his life with a pregnancy. Arthur was silent, processing the information. The name sounded vaguely familiar, but he couldn't place it. He told Magnolia they would get married as soon as possible, that he would legally adopt Violet and Iris before anyone had a chance to cause trouble, and they would hire their own team of investigators to stay one step ahead of whatever Bryce and his partners tried to do. That night, as the family slept, Arthur lay awake, planning strategies to protect the people he loved. He didn't know it yet, but the revelations about Magnolia's past would bring consequences that would change everything again. The peace they had found was about to be tested once more, and this time the enemy could be someone with legal rights to one of the girls. The call came on a Monday morning while Arthur was preparing breakfast for the family. It was Robert, and the tension in his voice immediately put Arthur on alert. He said that they had found Charles Henry Fields. The name hit Arthur like a punch. He asked where. Robert explained that he was in Denver, as Magnolia had said, but he was no longer a sales representative. He was now a regional manager for a large construction company, married with 2 children and living a stable life. When Arthur asked if he knew about Iris, Robert confirmed that he did now. Bryce's investigators had gone to him last week, told him about the existence of his daughter, and, most importantly, about the fact that she was being raised by another man without his knowledge or consent. Arthur sat down heavily in a kitchen chair and asked how he had reacted. Robert said he was coming to Ridgeport today to meet his daughter and assess the situation personally. At that moment, Iris entered the kitchen, still in her pajamas, rubbing her sleepy eyes. She said, "Good morning, Daddy Arthur," using the term she had been avoiding for the first time. The timing of the phrase broke Arthur's heart. He said good morning to his princess, and asked if her mother was awake. She replied that her mom was helping Violet get ready for school and asked if she could have some orange juice. He said of course she could. While pouring the juice for Iris, Arthur continued the phone conversation in a low voice, asking Robert what legal rights the man had. Robert explained that as the biological father who never renounced his paternity, he could theoretically claim partial or even full custody of the child, especially if he could prove that Magnolia had deliberately hidden the child's existence. When Arthur protested that she had tried to contact him, Robert pointed out there was no way to prove it, as they were informal attempts without legal documentation. Magnolia entered the kitchen then, followed by Violet in her school uniform. Noticing the tension in Arthur's voice, she immediately understood something serious was happening. After Violet left to get her backpack, she asked what was wrong. He told her Charles Henry was coming there today. Magnolia's face instantly paled. Iris, who was drinking her juice, stopped and looked at the two adults, asking who Charles Henry was. Magnolia knelt in front of her daughter, choosing her words carefully. She asked Iris if she knew she had a heart daddy, who was Arthur. Iris said yes. Magnolia continued, explaining that she also had a blood daddy who helped bring her into the world, and he was coming to meet her today. Iris, looking confusedly at Arthur, said she already had a daddy and asked why she needed another one. The innocent question perfectly summarized the complexity of the situation. Before anyone could answer, the doorbell rang. Arthur looked through the peephole and saw a man of about 35, well-dressed, with features that were undeniably similar to Iris's. Behind him was an older man Arthur recognized as one of the lawyers who had represented Bryce at the hearing. Arthur murmured that it was him. Magnolia said she would get the door, taking a deep breath to prepare herself. When the door opened, Charles Henry looked directly at Magnolia with an expression that mixed surprise and hurt. He said her name, and she said his. Noting he hadn't changed much, he replied that she hadn't either, but apparently her life had changed a lot, glancing over her shoulder at the luxurious house. He remarked that he saw she had made a good arrangement for herself. She told him it wasn't what he was thinking. He questioned her, a single woman with 2 daughters living with a rich businessman, and asked what exactly he should think. Arthur approached, standing protectively beside Magnolia. He introduced himself as Arthur Blackwood and said he believed they needed to talk. Charles replied that he needed to talk to his daughter and tried to look inside the house, asking where she was. Magnolia pleaded with him to be civil and invited him in to introduce them. In the living room, the tension was palpable. Charles sat in an armchair, clearly uncomfortable, while his lawyer remained standing, observing everything professionally. Magnolia gently called for Iris to come here. The girl entered the room and stopped upon seeing the strangers. Instinctively, she moved closer to Arthur, holding his hand. Magnolia told Iris that this was Charles, her biological daddy. Charles looked at the daughter he had never seen, and his expression visibly softened. There was an undeniable resemblance between them, the same large, expressive eyes, the same face shape. He said hello to Iris, trying to smile, and told her she was even more beautiful than he had imagined. Iris hid behind Arthur's legs, saying she didn't know him. He said he knew, but he would very much like to get to know her, and asked if he could. The girl looked at Arthur, then at Magnolia, clearly confused and frightened by the situation. She asked with the brutal honesty of children why he had never come to see her before. Charles looked at Magnolia with accusation in his eyes, saying it was because her mother had never told him she existed. Magnolia protested that it wasn't true, that she had tried. He cut her off, asking what she had tried, sending a Facebook message. He declared that wasn't trying. It was the minimum possible effort just to be able to claim she had tried. Arthur felt Iris squeeze his hand harder. The girl was clearly disturbed by the tension between the adults. He suggested to Mr. feels that perhaps it would be better to talk in private first, before involving Iris in the discussion. Charles refused, saying he came there to meet his daughter, not to be controlled by him. He addressed Iris directly, asking if she knew she had the right to know her real father and to spend time with him. Iris, surprising everyone with her firmness, replied that her real father was Arthur. He had taken care of her when she was sick, protected her and loved her. Charles countered that he could have done all of that too, if he had known she existed. Iris, with disconcerting logic, asked why he didn't know then. Charles's lawyer spoke for the first time, stating that Mr. Blackwood, his client, had legal rights to this child and recommended they seek an amicable solution, because if it went to court... Arthur's voice grew harder as he asked if that was a threat. The lawyer replied that it was a legal reality, that a biological father who never renounced his paternal rights could claim custody of his child. At that moment, something unexpected happened. Iris let go of Arthur's hand and walked up to Charles, observing him closely. She said he looked like her. He, moved, replied that he really did, that she had his eyes. She then asked if he had a family, other children. Charles hesitated before answering that he did, a wife and 2 sons. She asked if they knew about her. He said they did now. She asked if they were happy about it. Charles's silence was revealing. Obviously, his family had not welcomed the news of Iris's existence. He finally said that sometimes families need time to adjust to changes. Iris declared she didn't want to go where she wasn't wanted, and returned to Arthur's side. She said that here she was wanted, loved, and this was her home. Charles was visibly shaken by his daughter's rejection, but his lawyer remained implacable. He stated that the child's opinion would be considered, but it was not decisive. He gave Mr. Blackwood and Mrs. Santos 48 hours to present a settlement proposal, otherwise they would file for custody. After Charles and his lawyer left, a heavy silence filled the house. Iris had retreated to her room, Violet was at school, and Arthur and Magnolia sat in the living room, trying to process what had just happened. Magnolia whispered, asking what they would do if they lost her. Arthur replied that they wouldn't, but for the first time in months, he wasn't sure he could keep that promise. The 2 days following Charles's visit were the most tense the family had experienced since the beginning of the crisis. Arthur hired the best family law specialists he could find, while Magnolia battled the guilt of having caused the whole situation by hiding her pregnancy years ago. Iris, meanwhile, had become quiet and introspective, spending hours drawing in her room. When Arthur asked what she was drawing, she showed him sheet after sheet of birds trapped in cages, a regression to the sad drawings she made when she lived with her aunt. On the morning of the Monday, the day before the deadline to present a settlement proposal, Robert brought news that completely changed the course of the situation. He told Arthur that their private investigator had discovered something important about Charles Henry Fields, entering the house with a folder full of documents. He wasn't exactly the exemplary family man he appeared to be. When asked what he meant, Robert explained that Charles had significant debts. The company where he worked was under investigation for bid rigging, and he had personally been notified that he might be fired. More importantly, his wife had filed for separation 3 weeks ago. Arthur sat down, processing the information, asking if Robert was saying he had shown up because he was financially desperate. Robert confirmed it was a strong possibility. A man in a difficult financial situation, facing a separation, who suddenly discovers he has a daughter being raised by a wealthy businessman. To some people, that would sound like an opportunity. Magnolia, who had been listening to the conversation, was visibly disturbed, asking if he would be capable of using Iris that way. Robert said they didn't know his true intentions, but they had to consider all possibilities. At that moment, Arthur's phone rang. It was an unknown number. When he answered, a woman introduced herself as Marina Fields, Charles Henry's wife. Arthur activated the speakerphone, signaling for Magnolia and Robert to be quiet. He acknowledged her, and she said she needed to talk to him urgently about Iris and her husband's intentions. She said she couldn't talk on the phone and asked if she could come to his house right away, stating it was very important. An hour later, Marina Fields was sitting in Arthur's living room, visibly nervous but determined. She was a woman of about 30, well-dressed, who carried in her eyes the weight of someone who had made a very difficult decision. She began by saying she had come because she needed him to know the truth about why Charles wanted custody of Iris. When asked what truth, she revealed that he wasn't interested in being the girl's father, but in the child support he could get from a rich man. The silence in the room was total. Magnolia covered her mouth with her hands, horrified. Arthur asked what she meant. She explained that Charles was in serious financial trouble, owed money to loan sharks, was about to be fired, and she had filed for separation because she discovered he was embezzling money from their children's accounts to gamble, and Iris was an opportunity for him. The lawyer had told him that if he got custody of the girl, he could demand retroactive and monthly child support from someone with Arthur's wealth, even if he didn't have her all the time. When Arthur pointed out that he had shown a genuine interest in meeting her, Marina scoffed, saying Charles never wanted to have children. Their 2 sons were accidents he had reluctantly accepted. The idea that now, at 35, he had developed paternal instincts was ridiculous. Marina opened her purse and took out some papers, saying she had brought copies of his conversations with the lawyer, where they planned the entire strategy of emotional blackmail. Arthur read the documents, feeling his anger grow with each line. The conversations revealed a calculated plan to use Iris as a means to extort money, with little to no real interest in the girl's well-being. He asked why she was telling him this, questioning her loyalty to her husband. She replied that she had 2 sons and knew what it was to truly love a child. What they had done for Iris, the love she showed for them, that was real. What Charles planned to do was cruel and selfish. When asked if she was willing to testify about this, she said she would do more than that, and that she had brought recordings of his conversations with the lawyer, recordings where he made it clear he saw Iris only as a source of income. At that moment, Iris came down the stairs and entered the room, stopping when she saw the unknown woman. She said a shy hello. Marina looked at the girl, and her eyes filled with tears. She greeted Iris, telling her she was more beautiful than she had imagined. Iris asked if she knew her blood daddy. Marina replied that she did, and that she knew he didn't deserve a daughter as special as her. Iris went to Arthur and sat on his lap, saying, "Daddy Arthur, I don't want to leave here." He promised her she wouldn't, and this time he was sure he could keep that promise. The next morning, when Charles and his lawyer arrived to hear the settlement proposal, they found an unexpected surprise. Besides Arthur, Magnolia, and Robert, Marina was present, accompanied by her own lawyer. Charles, visibly shaken, asked Marina what she was doing there. She replied that she was preventing him from ruining an innocent child's life, as he had ruined their families. Robert took the floor, informing Mr. Fields that they had evidence that his quest for custody of Iris was not motivated by paternal interest, but by financial interest. When Charles called it absurd, Robert stated they had recordings of him planning how to extort money from Mr. Blackwood using Iris as a pretext, documents proving his financial difficulties and gambling problems, and the testimony of his wife about his true intentions. Charles's lawyer tried to protest, but Robert continued. He said, most importantly, they had a final proposal. Mr. Blackwood was willing to pay off all his current debts and guarantee a monthly sum for his subsistence for the next 2 years, provided he officially and definitively renounced all paternal rights to Iris. Charles looked around the room. Realizing he was completely cornered, he asked what would happen if he refused. Robert explained that the evidence would be presented to the district attorney for attempted extortion, and he would face not only losing the custody case, but also criminal charges. It was Marina who delivered the final blow. She told Charles to accept the offer, that it was more money than he ever dreamed of getting, and it would allow him to start his life over, far away from them, far away from all the people he had hurt. Charles looked out the window where he could see Iris playing in the garden with Violet, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding about her future. Finally, he said he accepted. 3 months later, during the festivities of the Ridgeport Winter Festival, Arthur and Magnolia formalized their union in a simple but emotional ceremony. Iris and Violet were the flower girls, wearing yellow dresses they had chosen themselves. The adoption process had been completed without any hitches, and now the girls legally carried the Blackwood surname. The company had fully recovered, and Arthur had implemented fairer labor policies, offering direct employment to mothers in vulnerable situations. Bryce Richards had been sentenced to 5 years in prison for fraud, blackmail, and racketeering. The New York investors had been investigated, and several of their companies were shut down for illicit practices. During the wedding reception, Iris approached Arthur with a new drawing. This time, it showed a family of 4 surrounded by colorful birds flying freely in a blue sky. She hugged him tightly and said, "This was their future, Daddy." He replied, looking at Magnolia and Violet dancing together on the small makeshift dance floor, that it was their victory, his princess. As the sun set over the Ridgeport Mountains that day, the Blackwood family was finally complete. 2 girls who had known only suffering and abandonment now had a home full of love. A woman who had fled from threats now had security and a family. And a man who had lived in solitude had discovered that true love sometimes arrives in the most unexpected ways. The house that once echoed with the emptiness of loneliness now vibrated with children's laughter, affectionate conversations, and the certainty that regardless of the challenges the future might bring, they would face everything together. The story that had begun with 2 desperate girls looking for help ended with a family that proved that love knows no bounds, that courage can overcome any adversity, and that sometimes the happiest endings are born from the most painful beginnings. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel. I promise to bring you videos every day that will make your life happier. Comment what you thought of my story with a rating from 0 to 10, and thank you very much.